Hi folks, this is Mr. Weston here, and this is the Final Fantasy trading card game Complete Opus 1, Part 6, Water. So we're going to take a look at all the water cards that you can get from Opus 1, minus the starters, which will be in the next video. Please check out the other few videos I've done, so you can take a look at all the other cards that are in there. Okay, so starting off, we have Agrias from Final Fantasy Tactics. There we go. This card, of course, does have first strike, meaning whatever card, if you attack a card that doesn't have first strike, this card's damage goes first. Her EX burst is if you can search for one card, Ovilia, and add it to your hand when she enters the field, or in the damage zone. More on that one later. Next up, we have Ultimisia from Final Fantasy VIII, aka, or in this case, Dissidia, Final Fantasy VIII. So, when she's out on the field, all forwards other than Ultimisia will enter the field dull. So, essentially, what that means is if she's on the field and your opponent brings out a card, it comes in dull. They can't do anything with it. So, if they have a card that even has Brave, it comes in dull. And of course, her ability Time Compression, you can freeze all the forwards other than Ultimisia, even your own. So, be careful with that one. Alrighty then. Next up, we have Alma from Final Fantasy Tactics. So if you control Ovilia, the cost of playing Alma onto the field is reduced by 1. So if Ovilia is on the field, this card's reduced by 1. I can dull her, I can draw a card, and I can discard one card from my hand. So there's that one. Next up is Van from Final Fantasy XII, and this is of course the Dissidia Final Fantasy version. This one is now dressed up as a pirate. So when he enters the field, you can draw a card, and when he forms a party and attacks, you can draw one card and discard a card from your hand. So that's a nice way to mitigate what cards you can bring in, so to speak. I think that's right. There we go. Now, next up is Warrior of Light. Now, this is, of course, the Dissidia Final Fantasy version. Now, I'm sure I mentioned something about standard units. So, if you do have them, all job standard units, which is this one listed here, all those forwards you control can gain 2,000 power and first strike. So there we go. I'm going to be showing off a couple of standard units here, but otherwise, any of them that you have gain 2,000 power and first strike. Now, I'm sure we've mentioned a couple of Ovilia cards. Here, not that one. That comes later. This is Ovilia. So, of course, any job knight forward you control gain 1,000 power. There are a couple of job knight cards there, but otherwise, 1,000 power to them. Now let's bring in Scholar from Final Fantasy III. So you can dull her, you can put it into the break zone, I can choose one forward you control, and I can turn it to its opponent's owner's hand. I imagine at some point there will be cards coming out that let you take control of a forward card that your opponent has. So playing Scholar would actually be quite useful for that, but otherwise, there's that one. Next up, we have Cloud of Darkness. So when she enters the field, each player can select a forward he or she controls. All forwards that are not selected are put into the break zone. So there we go. Essentially, this will whittle down your list of forwards on both sides to just 1. That's not too bad, actually. Next up is Avoca from Final Fantasy III. Again, another standard unit card, and probably one that you should probably try and get rid of straight away. Because again, no abilities at all. Okay, next up we have Gordon from Final Fantasy II. So if you dull him, the next damage dealt to Gordon becomes 0 this turn. So there you go. Which of course does mean any summons that try and attack him, none of that damage will be effective. So there you go. But of course that does mean next damage. So if your opponent tries to use another summon on Gordon, well, he's gone potentially. Next up is White Mage from Final Fantasy Tactics. So when White Mage enters the field, I can choose a forward and activate it. So essentially, if I was to bring out Gordon, dull him, I can then play White Mage and activate him again. Therefore, any damage done to Gordon becomes 0. So he could potentially still attack. There we go. Alright. Next up we have Cecil from Final Fantasy IV. Now this is of course the Paladin version. So summons or abilities of your opponent must choose Cecil if possible. So essentially, if there's a card out there that is come into play, they must choose Cecil as their target. So there you go. That's a nice little card to have. Now, next up, we have Titus from Final Fantasy X. Now, this is, of course, the Dissidia Final Fantasy version. So each forward other than Titus I control, he gains 1,000 power. So say if I was to have another three forwards out, he'll have 10,000 power rather than like just 7. And of course, if I activate Blitz Ace, which is discarding a copy of him and discard, and of course paying 2 water until the end of the turn, Titus gains Brave, and he can attack as many times as your points of damage. So say if I was to have 5 points of damage, he can attack 5 times. That's pretty good. Now next up we have Titus from Final Fantasy X. So when he attacks, all the ward forwards I control can gain 1,000 power until the end of turn. So that's also pretty impressive as well. But probably not as impressive as the last Titus. So take with that what you will. Next up we have Knight from Final Fantasy III. Now this is of course a standard unit. So if I was to have Warrior of Light on, these ones can have another 2,000 power and first strike. But of course, any forwards forming a party with Knight don't receive any damage. So even if I was to have, say, I don't know, Gordon on the field and attacking with Knight, Gordon would not receive any damage at all. So that's nice to have. And of course, next up, we do in fact have not that one again, this version of Knight from Final Fantasy III. This is just a lower cost to the other Knight that you have. So if you can just pay one forward, and you can bring this one out. Next up, we have Viking. Now, despite the fact that it is only 1,000 power, when it enters the field, you can draw 1 card. So if you are trying to get a few extra cards in there, it's nice to have this one here. Next up we have Geomancer. Now of course this is the forward version, so when Geomancer is put from the field into the break zone, I can just draw 1 card. So that's not too bad. Next up we have another Geomancer, this one the backup version. So I can dull this card, I'll look at the top card of my deck, I can also place it at the bottom of my deck if I choose to. So I can pretty much have a look and see what card is available in my next turn. So that's alright. Let's move these off. There we go. Next up, we have Fairy from Final Fantasy Tactics. So I can choose a forward that's dull. I can activate it, meaning it's back up here. And I can just draw a card. So that's okay. I mean, it's pretty... So when Fairy does come into play, if I had a few dull cards, I can just activate them instead. Alright, next up we have Minwu from Final Fantasy II. So pretty much it's saying the forwards you control don't receive damage that is less than their power. Meaning, if I was to even attack with Knight, say on Titus would not receive any damage at all. So this card is extremely useful in a water deck, and in fact standard if you can actually get a hold of 3 at least. But of course you only need 1 to put out on your backup, because you're only allowed 1. That side there, I'll explain that in a little bit. But otherwise, nice to have. In fact, standard to have is what I should say. Next up, we have Moogle from Final Fantasy Tactics. So this is an EX burst, so I can just draw 2 cards, and I then discard 1 card from my hand. So it's a nice little EX burst and a summon to have. And it's a low cost as well, so there you go. Next up, we have Mime from Final Fantasy Tactics. So when my attack phase starts, I can name any element I want, and the element I name is the element that the Mime uses. So rather than being at just water, I can have it be fire, wind, earth, lightning. There you go, either one of those. And of course, when he forms a party and attacks, I can draw 1 card. That's pretty impressive. Alright, next up we have Yang Roche from Final Fantasy 13. Summons or abilities of your opponent must choose Yang Roche if possible. So say if I was to have Minwu and Yang Roche on my side of the field, your opponent has Archer, you could destroy Minwu, but he must choose Yang Roche. So that's pretty effective to have, especially when Minwu's effect is extremely useful. Alright, next up we have Yuge from Final Fantasy 13. So when Yuge enters the field, I can just draw 1 card and place 1 card from my hand to the bottom of the deck. So if I was to have, say, an EX burst in my hand, I can draw a card, and then I can place the EX burst in my hand on the bottom of my deck, if I so choose to myself. Next up we have Yuna from Final Fantasy X. So this one pretty much says that when she enters the field, I can choose 1 forward and I can return it to the opponent's hand. And of course, when she's on the field, I can choose to have if a character is put from the field into the practice, I can have it removed from the game instead, therefore meaning they can't bring it back. Alright, so now we have a 5-cost unit. Let's bring out a 2-cost unit. Now this one's also from Final Fantasy X. So the cost to require cast your water summons is reduced by 1. So Moogle's already at 1, so it can't become 0. I've already got a fairy, that cost becomes 1. So there's a few water type summons out there so far. And speaking of water summons, here is Leviathan from Final Fantasy Tactics. I can choose a forward and I can return it to its opponent's hand. So if I was to, if say the opponent brings out Cloud of Darkness, which is pretty much a 6-cost summon, 6-cost forward I should say, I can return it to its opponent's hand and they've got to bring it back again and cost it another 6. So they could essentially just be discarding 3 cards or paying as many forwards and bring it back that way. Next up is Lilia from Final Fantasy 2. When she deals damage to an opponent, I can draw 1 card. So when she attacks and the opponent brings 1 card into the damage zone, I can draw 1 card. And finally, we have Waka from Final Fantasy X. So all the water forwards I control gain 1000 power. So this is almost similar to Avilia. The only difference is it doesn't regulate to just the night job, but rather all forwards, or water forwards I should say. And there you have it, that's all the water cards from Final Fantasy, from Opus 1. So there we go, this is Mr. Weston. I will see you guys next time for part 7. Bye.